So in your data journey, a common process that our customers go through is what we would call the data journey. And that covers different stages where you're discovering data, you're bringing different data sources together, and you're starting to cleanse and prepare that data for different uses. And then ensure that your data quality and privacy measures are respected, implementing different data quality requirements. Okay. So analyzing and sharing data. So one of the things that you run into is the need to share data with multiple different parts of your organization. And sharing that data, if you don't do it right, you're going to be duplicating your efforts to present and share that data, and it's going to be very difficult to govern and make sure that data is well formed and cleansed before that's used. So the ability to share that data that's high value, that you've curated, that you've stored in a trusted place, that's pretty critical. And the ability to govern how that data is accessed is essential to a successful data strategy. Okay. One moment, please. Okay. All right, so let's move forward. So what's so unique about Talend's data fabric? Why is this important? Number one, our platform is unified. So your data integration, the integrity and governance of what you have in a single platform with real-time capabilities. So the same platform you can address applying data quality measures to your data and reaching out to multiple different types of data sources and integrating them together, doing lots of data processing. It is the same platform that you can use to do, say, build APIs and web services, or plug into a messaging queue, a Kafka queue, and listen for messages to be processed in real time. Okay. So flexible. You need to be able to use a platform like this flexibly. The integration space is highly dependent on the ability to extend a platform or to meet varying requirements that you might not be able to anticipate, from a product build standpoint. So the ability to extend the platform and say build your own component or deploy anywhere you need to, whether it's a Linux or a Windows machine, or it's in the cloud or on premise or in multi-cloud or in a combination of those things. That's pretty important these days as well. Also, to have a platform that grows with you. As you go through that data journey, it's important to be able to add in and leverage the different technologies that are required for your current needs. So if you start out, say, in data integration, you're just doing some ETL, and then a couple of years later, you're implementing data quality measures along the way, and then somebody needs some certain data in a different department, and you have the opportunity to stand up an API. Well, you can use the platform for all those things, and then further into things like data cataloging and governance, right? Okay, so let's talk about application integration. Okay, so Talend provides, we're going to start with API. Talend provides what we call an API delivery platform or API delivery capability. So this entails several phases of the API development cycle. And then you can plug into the API management tool of your choice. So if you're in Azure and that's your preferred, environment, well, then you probably use Azure API management. Same thing with AWS API Gateway if that's your kind of preferred cloud. And with Google, you're going to have Apigee. You could deploy that on premise, and there are a number of other API management and gateway products out there you can plug into. So the Talend feature set in this is based around API first tooling, and then of course routes and data services for message routing. All right. So the demo that I'm going to walk through here is based on a higher education use case. So we have students at some college or in some group of colleges, and that core student data was spread out into many different silos, and the staff of the school over time has taken Talend's data integration, data quality capabilities, and gathered and transformed and curated this data so it's deduplicated and it's cleansed and it's complete, and they've fed it into a data store that they now want to share that data out to different applications. So that is where we are today. Is we need to look at an API or build an API to provide that data out to other applications in that organization, whether it's phone applications or different other server-based or web-based applications. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is through these four kind of phases. Number one is design. So we're going to use Talend's API Designer as a web-based cloud application. And then we're going to implement with Talend Studio. We're going to test our API with Talend's API Tester. And then we're going to look at deployment to deploy into an environment and run. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen. Share out screen one. Okay. So you should be able to see my screen at this point. Hopefully everybody's able to find the right window. My live view still has the slide on it. Okay. Okay, I see now. All right, so you should be able to see my screen with the audience view rather than the live view. It's going to have a student API documentation on it, where here I have a published documentation that's been published from Talend Cloud, and I can navigate through this API here on the left. Okay, and if I want to navigate down to, say, one of the operations here and see how that operation is defined and what it expects with this API, I can see all the different information here, including, of course, example data if that's provided in the doc, and as well as response information, how this response is going to be returned and what it's going to look like, so that as, let's say, I'm a developer who needs to build a client for this API, using this documentation is going to get me started very quickly. It's going to be pretty clear and tell me how I need to authenticate and all those things. So designing that documentation is, I just switched over to the Talend Cloud app, where you can design your API documentation and definitions however you'd like. So here, if I go to my operation here for get students, then I can see, my query parameters here are defined, and if I need to add some information or some metadata here, then, I can certainly do that. So I could put a default last name of Smith or something like that. And I simply unclick the edit icon, and then I've got my new entry in there. Okay. So it's very easy to work with, very easy to interface with, and this is where you can define multiple different response types. So let's say I have a JSON and I have an XML type I can return, or maybe a flat file type, be more of a CSV, and maybe I have an error response that I want to document here that I might send. I can put all those inside of here. Okay. So once you've defined your API, then you can click on the different buttons down below if you want to see the actual OpenAPI spec that's generated. Okay, so this is the generated markup that's created based on what you build inside your operation configurations. Okay, and this is OpenAPI specification, so it's standards-based and it's compatible. So let's say I want to export this to AWS's API gateway. Well, it's going to actually allow me to automatically choose the most optimal configuration to upload into AWS. If I want to do Azure, I can click over and it'll switch it over for me. Or I can just open it up and choose however I'd like to here as well. Okay, and then filter different pieces that I want. So this is designed to be able to plug into your API gateway and API management systems, as well as any other tool that you might want to use against OpenAPI spec. Okay. A couple other things to highlight here. Number one, this in the documentation section, you can set it up to publish on a web URL, which is where this one is, and this will be hosted by Talend. Okay, so you don't have to publish it into some other place. You can actually just, let us host it for you, and you can secure it with a password, or, just your internal team, or you can open it up to everybody. That's an alternative to, say, exporting it from here and plugging it into an API gateway or an API catalog of sorts. So mocking an endpoint, you can click this button and it'll turn on a mock endpoint. You don't have to really do anything more. If you send requests to that URL, then it will respond with the data that's built into your documentation. So it's another way that somebody building a client can quickly get up and running and quickly test some basic functionality while they don't have access to, say, a dev or a full-blown API implementation. All right. And finally, you can plug into your GitHub account, and you can also access a management API and automate exports from this tool as well. Okay, so that we just talked about the API designer, and what we'll do is in the next step, we're going to jump into the Talend Studio, and that's going to allow us to implement this API design. Okay, so I'm going to switch to Talend Studio. Now I should note that this is the same studio where you can build ETL jobs and big data jobs and data quality. It's the same studio that does all those things. So now if I look inside my metadata, and this is a place, if you've never seen Talend Studio before, in metadata you can bring in database connections and ingest tables to keep the schemas here, as well as other file types and schemas for those. And things like Salesforce, Workday, Azure, it helps you store specific types of metadata. One of those types, though, is REST API definitions or OpenAPI spec. And this allows me to plug into my Talend Cloud account, and pull in the different APIs that I have access to there. Okay. And so now I have this API metadata here, and all I have to do is actually just drag and drop it onto the canvas, and that allows me to have a component generated for me that's going to have all the different REST API flows or mappings created for me. So, for instance, this one, get by student ID, it's taken directly off of my operation here in my student API definition, get by student ID. So it pulls all the metadata straight out of here. And at that point, you'll be able to take your design canvas and your REST component that was just dropped, and you'll be able to pull your different pathways out of it. And these each represent one of those different API operations. So we have a couple of gets, we have a post, and we have a delete. Okay. So you may notice that there are some of these REST components on the end of these lines here, on the end of the pathways. That's because they're there to help define what the response is going to look like for that API. So only one of these will fire in a given API, operation. And so this is where you can say, this is an okay response, or maybe a 404, or if there's an exception, you're using the an exception catcher. T-log catcher would do it. Then you can send an internal server error as well if you catch like a Java exception. And so what we have here is a couple of different types of components are framing our processing for this API, our regular processing components. Everything inside of here is just a regular ETL style component that you can use with Talend's data integration and data quality. For instance, this is MySQL, but the database input components exactly the same. The T fuzzy match component from Talend's data quality, we're doing some fuzzy matching here as part of one of the lookups. So all these are just basic DI components, and we have a library of about 1,000 of them. Okay. So let's say that I'll take you through one of the flows here, a simple one to help illustrate some of the principles. So here's this first operations connected to my XML map. And this is going to manage a lookup into my student table. So it's doing a database query. So inside my XML map, I've got my main input. It includes my ID for my student that came from my API request. And it's doing a join into my student lookup based on that student ID. I'm also publishing this ID out into what we call the global map, which is key value pairs, and that allows me to inject the value for this into the lookup component itself. So if I come out of here and go to my lookup component, I can see that I'm injecting the value of that student ID into the SQL here. Okay. So I took the generated basic SQL, I added a where clause, and then I'm injecting that value. So that's going to get me, the unique record that I want to while I'm doing that lookup. Okay, so now on the outbound of this thing, we've got a couple of different outputs. Number one is just a regular response. There's some basic, it can be used as JSON or XML is being generated here. And then we've got what's called a catch for the inner join reject. So this, in the event that this join on the left fails, meaning that there's no record for whatever ID was sent in, then it's going to catch that and send this output in the bottom, and the one on the top won't be sent at all. So we've got that set to true, so it will catch when nothing's found. And then there's a message that's built in here with to describe what happened here. We can't find that ID. And then it's put into, an XML or JSON structure. So that's how you can see this is configured. Okay. So if I look further down, I've got my first response, which comes out as an OK or a 200, so regular response. And then my second, I've got set to a resource not found. So the record, didn't exist, so I send you a 404 is what's going to happen there. Okay. Okay. So in working with these APIs, if you've worked with Talend jobs in general, then it's pretty consistent. You just go to the Run tab. You've got all your setup here where you can change your JVM parameters and different other options, and you can just run this job. Well, here's an important part though. With regular Talend jobs, they generate Java code, and that code is designed to run sequentially, almost like a script, because in general, batch jobs have a start, they run, and then they end, right? They move their billion records, and then they shut down until you tell them to go again. Well, APIs and other real-time solutions, they run forever. And as a result, they have other needs. And what you'll find with Talend APIs, Talend data services like the one you're looking at now, this is actually generated, it's wrapped into a JAX RS interface. So the code is generated differently according to best practices for Java APIs, particularly RESTful APIs, because it's JAX RS, and then it's stood up using Apache CXF, which is a highly popular and highly performant framework. So it's important to point out here that this isn't just say an ETL engine or black box where we have some REST endpoints cobbled on the end of it. It's actually generated from the ground up as a RESTful web service within the Java framework that you don't even have to worry about here. So it's pretty important. So we can perform rather well when it comes to the REST operations and low overhead types of needs. Okay, so this is the implementation, and then API tester is going to be the next stop. So we're going to go ahead and test this API and see how it goes. So if I go back out to my browser, if you remember, this was the designer. The API designer is cloud-based, right? So it's hosted by Talend. Well, the API tester is a plugin into Google Chrome. So so it's able to make local API requests in your environment where you're running it. Okay, so if I look at this, let's see, I'll go ahead and send a request to my studio. I've got my different contexts or my environment variables here that are going to be used, and then I'll send a couple of different properties here to go and get some students. So if I send this in, it'll take a moment. And then I've got some records that are returned based on my query parameters. Now, if I look in my studio, just like if you're running a Talend job, a regular ETL job, you can see the metrics and the number of records that have come across each leg of the process here. So we had 92 records come out of the database. We used some fuzzy matching to narrow those down to 5 records. And those were packaged into a JSON response, which is going to show up as one row and then sent back to us. So you kind of trace this out and even use the business debug or the traces debug features here. Okay, so let's say that, and I can also see at the bottom, I've validated something. You can run assertions that say, validate your status code or different pieces of that response and make sure they look how you want them to. So it just validated that we got a 200 back. Well, let's say that you want to send in multiple requests that are related to each other. We call that a scenario. And this will take however many requests that you want to create and send them in sequence. So if I click play here, it'll go ahead and send them all through my studio. Okay, let me switch to my actual deployed service here on my laptop, and I'll send that through. All right, so that's a little better. So here we have, you can see it ran in under a second to go ahead and send all those requests. And the steps that I've created here, they do 4 things. Obviously, they add a new student, to the API data set. That's obviously through the API. So they do a post and they get the student. So to go and get the student and verify that the student looks, how like the student I sent in the first place. And then third is to delete that student. So I'm going to go and delete the student that I sent in, and then I'm going to finally try and get the student one more time, and then make sure that it can't return that student. So I should get the 404 on this last step. All right, so if I look at these different requests, here's the first one. I'm just sending in some JSON. I should get a 202 back because it doesn't have any data in the response really. The next step is to get that student and make sure it looks the same. So here I've got an interesting part here. I'm taking a piece of the previous request and I'm using it inside of this URI. So it's pretty common knowledge about RESTful APIs if you're in that space. You know that the actual ID or field pieces of data tend to be inside of the actual pathway here, typically some identifying data like an ID. So that's what we're doing here is we're inserting that ID value into this path. To do that, or to create this expression, you can click the expression builder. And if I browse here in my student API, I can go through my scenario and my first request. And then if I get into the body of that request and the student object, which I'm in JSON now, it's traversing through the JSON, I can go to my student ID. So now I can just pull that piece of data out from my request payload and insert it with the insert button. And then that's how this expression gets created for me. Okay, so we can see that in this request, the response has the data that was sent in. We've got the status code's right, but we're also running an assertion here to validate this JSON body response. So we're grabbing the student object out of that JSON body. So this is JSON path as a standard. And we're using an expression again to grab that student object out of the previous request. So it's going to validate the entire object for me. I could get more granular with this and add assertions here for each of the fields that I feel are relevant, but this is good for now. All right, and then the next step is to go ahead and delete that student. So it's a pretty simple request. And then finally, we're running one more request to go and try and retrieve that student one more time and verify we have a 404. So we also see why that message about not finding that student in there. Okay, so all of these different features, these designs for your tests, they can be run manually from your Chrome browser, or you can also export your test designs and you can plug them into a CI/CD process. So now, so far, we've got the API designer storing your designs in Open API spec, where you can call into it and have an export of your spec brought out through an API. You've also got our tester component, where you can build scenarios and requests to test your APIs and plug them into CI/CD. Say you deploy them into your environment, you run your tests in CI/CD after the deployment to make sure that the basic functionality that you've built out for tests, functions in your new deployment, and automate the whole thing. Okay, and then what you'll find when we talk about a little bit about architecture in the Talend Management Console is that Management Console has an API too to manage deployments through our console. So you can manage the entire deployment process here. The only step that's manual is the actual implementation of that API, within that build process after your design is done, your tests are created. Okay. All right. So that was the test part of this steps. The next is going to be operate. So let's say that I want to run my API. Okay, and what I'll do is I'll go up and find my API in my job designs. So I can right click on this and I can publish it to cloud. And what that's going to do is it's going to package my API in a deployable so that it's ready to go out there and deploy it. And it's going to bring it into Talend Management Console. So I'm going to refresh my browser so it refreshes my session here. Okay. All right. So if I go into management and I look at my workspace here, what you're going to have is your API is going to show up within the Talend Management Console. You can create a task to deploy it there. So here I have my API. It's running on my remote engine that I've created, and I'll talk about what a remote engine is shortly. And we can see, the requests that it's fielded. It's not very active lately, but it's fielded requests recently, and I can access the logs here as well to find out what's going on that API. Okay, you can also filter logs and do searches to find whatever errors or timestamps you're looking for as well. All right, so it's pretty much as simple as that. You just come in here, you deploy your artifact, and you can change your context parameters to suit as you need to. And you can also access information about this artifact or this API. So I can see my design, I can see that I published it, and kind of a history of available versions for you to work with as well after you publish them. All right. So when you deploy this, this API right now is deployed to one of my remote engines, the one that's actually running on my laptop from before. You can set this up to deploy to many different servers. So if I go back here and look at my engines, I've got many different servers here, and I can also set up clusters. So I can have multiple servers that are pulled into your cluster and kind of managed as a unit. So you can deploy to a bunch of servers at one time, and you don't have to, manually step through it and deploy them all. So you can get your API up and running in multiple places very quickly. Usually what you'll have is that will be your multiple servers in your cluster will be set behind either a load balancer or more likely an API gateway like we talked about earlier. Right. Okay, so that's the operations side of it. I'm going to jump into slides here and talk about that for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and end my screen share, so I'm going to switch over to slides. Okay. So routing. So this is going to be about event-based messaging and orchestrating in real time. So we're going to cover the routing part, and then we're going to get into some architecture. Okay, so routing is based on Apache Camel, so the Talend routing capabilities. So we can deploy into distributed topologies, so geographically distributed or hybrid multi-cloud, things like that. Standards-based connectivity, so we plug into many standards as an extension of Apache Camel itself. It's a mediation capability that's based on enterprise integration patterns, and it's designed to run in real time, so event-based integrations. One important thing to point out here is that it's plugged into our design studio, our Talend studio, and it has access to the data integration component set, as well as data quality, of course. So you can actually create routes that leverage data integration capabilities, components, connectivity, transformation stuff, and run that as a unit, as an embedded, essentially, Java processor within your routing solution. So I'd like to jump out and show that for just a moment. Okay, so I just share my screen again So you should be able to see my screen share. And I'm going to go into my studio and then over to route designs. So here inside of route designs, this is where what you build is going to, let's say it's a route rather than a job, and it will generate an Apache Camel route for you. Okay, so if I look at the one I have open, I can run it much like running a job. It'll start up and run for me, and it'll kind of show me what it's doing on the screen, right? It'll also allow me to jump into that data integration layer as well. So it took a moment to build there. I'll show you the DI stuff as well. Okay, so here we go. So here we have some output from this. You can see that some routing is being accomplished here. We've got different records, person records, and we have an attribute here called type. And type can be A, B, or C that we know of. And so I've got some conditional routing built in here where I've got an expression. In this case, it's using XPath. The screen share won't let me display it all, but in this case, it's using XPath, but it could also use, an expression language, a different expression language for looking at different parts of the message, or a JSON path, or something like that. And so you can, choose what you need to for the job here. And so we've got a type that's being routed to the top pathway, and then the middle pathway is type B, and the bottom pathway is type C. So the idea here is maybe you have different messaging queues you're routing these to. You could have a JMS output here, or SQS, or something like that. Maybe Kafka, or maybe you're going to use a Talend job to persist this data into a database table. So you can plug into a Talend job, and you can access the job creation layer, the job design layer from there, and you can design your job logic at that point. Now that job logic is simply going to end up as a Java class within your actual built solution. So it's just calling some Java code. It's not actually making a remote call or an external call of any kind necessarily. Okay. Now, in the same way, your source of your data could be many different things. You could publish a REST interface, or you could call out to a REST service and pull it. You could be picking up or watching a file directory, or plugging into something like Azure Event Hubs or Kafka maybe. And so it's really modular in that respect as far as where things can come from, where they need to go. The types of processing you can do, there are a lot of them. So you can do things like aggregate multiple heterogeneous messages together. You can do things like message filtering or content-based routing, like is in here. Multicast and parallel processing, routing slips, so dynamically route to different steps as needed, as what's derived from the content of the message, perhaps. You can split up a payload into multiple different messages. So maybe you have a delimited file and you want to split it into records after it drops, then you could do that here. And then maybe route those records and transform them and send them to different queues. Those types of scenarios are handled rather well here inside of our routing canvas. Okay. So back to the slides. That is our routing capability. We can go into architecture now, and then I'll hit up some questions after that. All right, Talend Cloud's architecture. This is a really key thing. Probably the most key thing to understand about our architecture is our remote engines. So you see, there's a couple of them here. The remote engine is simply a Talend agent that sits on a server of your choosing. So the remote engine is, if you're familiar with the Talend job server from the past, it's a lot like that, where let's say you have an Amazon EC2 server or an Azure VM or even an on-premise server or VM that you need to run the compute inside of. Then you would install Talend's remote engine, and that remote engine would keep in touch with Talend Cloud for listening for scheduling and sending back status information and the logs, things like that. So that type of kind of meta information is transferred through those gray lines through an HTTPS channel. So it's an outbound connection, and it's as firewall friendly as it could possibly be. Meanwhile, the remote engines will simply kick off say if you're running a batch job, they'll kick off those jobs as a separate process. Or if you're running Talend APIs or routes as a microservice build, then you can deploy and kick off those routes and run them as a standalone microservice on that server. Or you can deploy into the Talend runtime, which is more of like an application server build. Okay, so those remote engines tend to run inside of your environment and probably close to the data source that they're going to work with, if there's a relational database in play or something like that. Okay. All right, and it's pretty common that our customers have multiple remote engines per environment. So if you have, let's say, 3 or 4 servers where you want to run an API or a bunch of APIs, then you could set up a remote engine cluster and deploy to all of them at once and have those sitting behind your API gateway or something like that.